Hello and welcome to the Vlogging Pod. Tonight we are joined by returning author Liz Crowe, or as you prefer, Elizabeth. Which one would you prefer?
Liz is good.
Liz, all right.
Yeah. Woohoo!
Welcome back.
Confetti.
Yeah, right. I wish it'd just be me cleaning it up here in the sound
I
booth
know,
after
right?
the fact. So outside of your book Hoopa, based in Detroit, you had some time living there as well, correct?
Well, I lived adjacent. I was Detroit adjacent where I lived. I
Okay.
lived in Ann Arbor. Okay, so that's the college
Okay.
town, about 35 miles to the west of Detroit. But I spent a
Okay.
lot of time there for various reasons. So yeah.
Okay. All right. And so, with your vast living experience, we talked last time, and I know we just talked about this pre-recording now, about how much your life as you've lived. There's no other way to put it that you have lived. So, tell us, give us some tales about Detroit.
Well, the thing about Detroit is we were there. We lived in Ann Arbor from 2004 to 2020, and we got to see Detroit. We got to watch a revival of a city
Oh.
that is just beautiful. I mean, the city, Detroit. It was a French, a Huguenot city, basically, and it was the gateway to Canada. And the history of it is amazing. The Prohibition history of it is amazing. And then the '60s came, and I can highly recommend. Can I throw in a book recommendation here and there
Yeah, go
about
right
this?
ahead. Yes, go right ahead.
Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides.
Mhm.
It's a big old thick, it's kind of a doorstop of a book, but he grew up there, and it's a telling of how the '60s, what happened, and how Detroit came to be, and how Grosse Pointe came to be. Grosse Pointe, and all of these things. So the '60s happened. There were riots. There was a whole lot of things that went down, and it emptied out. It became a ghost town,
Mm.
literally. I mean, it was just one of those places that you could drive around it was like a major metropolitan downtown city, and there was nobody there, you know.
Right.
And I went there a lot. I have a really good friend who's an artist, and when we first met, we both worked at the art center in Ann Arbor. I did marketing. She was the education director, and she had been commissioned to do an outdoor piece of art in Detroit, in one of the parks.
Oh, nice.
And so, yeah, it was cool. And she needed engineering help, and her husband's an engineer, kind of a different kind of engineer. So my husband helped her kind of engineer the process, and we helped set it up and everything. So she and I just made a point to go down there a lot after that. It was a cool place. The DIA, for one thing, the Detroit Institute of Arts, is amazing. The murals are famous there, anyway, and there a lot of the working. What is his name? Frida Kahlo's husband. That guy. You know what I'm talking about.
Right. Okay.
He did that. Oh God, I'm drawing a blank. But anyway, his murals in the DIA are worth the trip,
Mhm.
because they depict the history of Detroit as a manufacturing city, right?
Right.
So they're just murals that are incredible. And now the DIA is super popular because of the revival. But anyway, the years 2004 to let's say about 2010 or 12 was when things started to change. And it's like a lot of cities, I hate this word, gentrifying, which is not always
Okay.
the best thing to happen to a city, because it pushes out longtime residents, typically residents of color.
Okay.
Um,
Right. Yeah.
and that is definitely happening in Detroit. But because
Basically clearing
I
out
feel like,
low income housing and stuff like
yes,
that. Yeah,
clearing
to
out low
make it
income
look
housing
more. Yeah. Yeah.
yep.
Yeah.
Chicago's
We're
happening
Go
everywhere,
ahead.
you know.
Yeah, we have a little bit in our area that's happening as well. I mean, don't
Yeah.
get me
Yep.
wrong, they're making things look better, but it's doing a disservice for those who have lived there for a long time.
It definitely is, and Detroit is guilty of that. Okay, so then long around, and I'm gonna screw up the dates on this. Like, don't, so
No,
nobody's
go
fact
right
check
ahead.
me. But the Rocket Mortgage guy. Okay, Dan. Again, drawing a blank. He spent
Okay.
some time in Cleveland, and he poured a ton of money into reviving Cleveland.
Mhm.
And then he relocated some of his Rocket Mortgage offices to Detroit, and he is responsible for a lot of the revival. He bought up a bunch
Right.
of property. He had people working downtown. You know, um, not everyone trusts his motives necessarily, but he kicked it off. So things really started to change. There's a family there that has been in charge of a lot of things. A white family. They own the Illiches. Okay, Illich is their
Mhm.
last name. They own Little Caesars Pizza. That's them. Okay, so
Okay.
he owns the again, don't fact check me. He owns one of the teams, maybe the Tigers, and of course the Ford family owns the Lions. So Detroit has always had plenty of sports. They have all the sports, pro sports, but the Pistons used to play way out in the suburbs, way out in a different county. The
Mhm.
Palace was where they played, and it
Right.
was this giant edifice an hour outside of Detroit. So now they play downtown because they've built this Little Caesars Arena place right right between Midtown and downtown. So they're trying to revive a section there. And again, it's the whole thing is chock full of hypocrisy and people who don't like it. But
Right.
that
Well,
said,
have you
um,
just because you're mentioning how they're trying to revise it in a different way, have you ever
mhm.
heard of, Nicole Curtis? She
No, I don't
actually
think so.
revitalizes old rundown homes and remakes them into what and she is big in Detroit, or at least she was for quite
Oh
a while.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And if
yeah, yeah.
you can
Cool.
actually follow her on Detroit Design on Instagram, it's fascinating
Oh
because
nice.
yeah, I understand that she was doing that for quite a bit, but Detroit was giving her some difficulties as far as redoing the old houses and, making them back, giving back the old houses the lives. That she would take vacant homes and she would remake them into what they used to be.
Right. Cool. That's
Mhm.
very cool.
Yeah, it
And
is.
then Detroit, Detroit is has distinct areas and they all have their own personality, and I just always loved it down there. And so my whenever we'd go, my imagination would just start spinning, because we're authors and we're always writing the next or coming up with the next plot in our heads. So I used it for a lot of things. um,
Mhm.
and I I try to make it as truthful as I can to the areas, because I know the areas pretty well. But we went back for one last time before. When did we go? It was last spring was the last time we were there. And it my daughter had moved back from Toronto. She and her partner were living in Corktown, which is a cool area. Corktown, of course, being the Irish traditionally where the Irish people lived. Next to
Right.
Mexican Town, which is obviously what that is, and then Greek Town, which is all in there together. Um,
Mhm.
and so we spent a weekend just poking around in places that we hadn't been in forever, and it night and day. I mean, to say it was a night and day is an understatement. You know,
Right.
things have just really blown up there.
Right.
And it's almost like, I don't want it to go back to the way it was, but there were some times when you could just kind of poke around and see some cool places. And it's a big city. People are like, oh my God, Detroit's so dangerous. I'm like, huh, have you ever been to Chicago? I mean, come on. There's just places
Yeah.
you don't go. You use your
Right.
common sense. And this, because I lived in Istanbul, so I had no fear, right?
Right.
So,
So
there's
tell
nothing to be afraid of.
So tell us the city's narratives, the highlights that added to your life, and probably added to your stories as well. Give us some of that.
Well, I always like to think about the people who would live there, right?
Mhm.
And
Right.
I'm not versed in like the city's. I'm not deeply versed in its history, other than what I know about in terms of its revival and what I've read about. In the '60s, I've read a lot of how it literally fell apart. You know,
Mhm.
white flight, I think was that phrase was invented um, in Detroit
Mhm.
because everybody left for Oakland and Macomb counties, which are the wealthier counties to the north and
Mhm.
northwest of Detroit. Um, so for me, the city was just like, it was kind of cool just to be down there and look up at those buildings and like imagine who would live there, you know,
Right.
during different times during the between 2004 and 2020. And that person who would have lived there has changed drastically. Now you can't touch a condo for less than about half a mil for one bedroom, which is cheap compared to
Wow.
Chicago, right?
Yeah. It's
But still,
atrocious, yeah.
yeah, but it's for Detroit. You know, I was looking at we almost bought a house down there when my daughter went to Wayne State, which is the university right in the city in Midtown.
Mhm.
And we were looking at a place, and we should have bought it. Kicked myself to this day for not buying it. It was in Woodbridge, which was a neighborhood near the campus, and it was some of the neighborhoods there. I mean, there was serious money in these neighborhoods. These people were uh, manufacturing scions, right? They were bazillionaires compared to, they would be bazillionaires right now. They were just merely millionaires at the time. But they had mansions. Like, I have a friend who sold real estate there, and he and his partner bought a house that had 4 stories, and the top floor was a ballroom.
Oh, wow.
But it was crumbling, rat infested.
Mm.
It was the neighborhoods there are it's cool. It's just cool to drive around and see the different how the neighborhoods change and have changed, became run down and horrible and scary, and now have become what they
Oh,
used to
yeah,
be almost. You know,
I can imagine.
and so for
There's
me, I think about people who lived there, who would have lived there, and who would be
right.
living there now, and what would they be doing, and why would they be there? So
There
that is
seems
how
to
I
be
came up.
there seems to be a vast difference between the suburbs in comparison to other cities as far as in Detroit. Would you say that that's true from where your time there?
What do you mean difference in the suburbs?
Um, just the fact that the comparison, a lot of people, from what I've done on my research, because I like to look up things so that we're going to talk
Yeah,
about, people say that the
yeah.
suburbs in comparison in Michigan to Detroit city's life is a
Mhm.
completely different, like you're entering a different realm, a different world. Would you
It
say
is.
that was
It
true?
is.
Okay.
It is. But the coolest thing about it is right smack in the middle of Detroit is its
Hmm.
very own suburb called Grosse Pointe. And
Oh,
Grosse
okay.
Pointe is, you should look this up because it's one of the older neighborhoods,
Hmm.
and it is cool, and all these things. And Grosse Pointe Blank is one of my favorite movies ever because they filmed it right there, you know. Um,
Right.
and it's a suburb within the city, literally. You're driving along, and then all this, and it's just kind of typical, one story, like car dealerships and rundown retail and whatever, and then bam, there's trees everywhere, and you're in this really expensive neighborhood. It is a bizarre experience. But the other suburbs are very wealthy, yes, and the experience is very different. But I would compare it to, because I'm fairly versed in the kind of the neighborhoods, the suburbs around Chicago, say
Hmm.
Chicagoland, like Schaumburg and Naperville, and even Evanston, where Northwestern is. I mean, those are living there is also is a vastly different experience than living in downtown Chicago, but they consider themselves part of Chicagoland, even though people who live in Chicago say they don't live in Chicago if you live in a suburb. Um, but it's less like that. People who live in the suburbs of Detroit don't usually say they live in Detroit. They say where they live. They say they're in Birmingham or Bloomfield Hills or Troy or Novi, or they give the name Wixom. They give the name of their suburb as
Right.
opposed to saying, yeah, we live in Detroit. Um, and so in that case, I would say yes. And the history of the flight, it's like Chicago just sprawled, you know, while
Right.
Detroit burned, literally, and
Right.
and people fled,
Now,
and it
when
created all kinds of trouble.
So when you were in Detroit and your visits back, how much experience have you ever had with Woodward, the main avenue that's traveling within Detroit? Do you have any
Oh yeah,
experience along that?
I
Okay.
have. Yeah, I've done. I mean, well, it's hard not to. It's the main drag, and it's 8 Mile. Okay, so
Uh-huh.
you know how I don't know if you know this, but Michigan counts up. There's 8 mile, 9 mile, 10 mile, 11 mile, 12 mile road. Literally, these are east-west running roads at those
Mhm.
mile markers. And 8 Mile, I don't know if you're familiar with the Eminem movie, called 8 Mile.
No. No, I'm
Half of
not.
8 Mile is 8 Mile, and then it turns into Woodward Road. Yep.
Okay.
So yeah, and I've been on there. I mean, it's hard. You're on it at some point if you're traveling around Detroit because it's the main drag, literally.
Mhm.
Um, and it's also the location of a famous like a car parade, if you will,
Okay.
because it's
Right.
cars, man. Detroit is still all about the autos.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And that was my husband's an automotive engineer. That's how we ended up in Michigan. So, we would go to the cruise. They called it the Woodruff Cruise, and it would start kind of out in the suburbs and make its way downtown. And it was cool. It was fun. You sit on the side, watch the cars. The classic cars, not so classic cars. I mean, it's just a car culture. And that's the
Right.
other thing about Detroit is its car culture. It exists because of automobiles.
So
Literally.
it's
So
so it's obvious that Detroit has had a very positive influence on you. So tell me,
yes.
because of that influence, tell me how many books came from Detroit itself.
Oh boy. Let me count. Well, the thing is, I've got a lot of them set in Ann Arbor, and it's kind of interchangeable. People go back and forth
Mhm.
a lot. This is actually set in Detroit. Uh, one that's out now, and then I have a series that's in a brewery. That's a brewery set series that is set sort of it's set. I will admit it, in the suburb of Detroit,
Mhm.
not Ann Arbor, but more Detroit centric. I have a series coming out about a fictional pro soccer team
Oh,
coming to Detroit,
nice.
because that's the only team they don't have. Even though Dan Campbell, that's his name. Dan Campbell tried to get tried to get the MLS expansion team, the one that I think ended up in Cincinnati. Because the thing about soccer expansions is that there has to be infrastructure, and there was really no place for them to play. And so he owned a property that was an old prison at one time, and it's still
Mm,
sitting there. And he was willing to tear it down and build the MLS level stadium. But other places had kind of already done that, and they had
right.
that in place. So Detroit didn't get it. I don't doubt that they will someday. They got everything else. They've got baseball. They've got a fine, proud sports tradition, and I love sports. I love the Lions. I love that they're getting better now. It's so cool to be a Lions fan now. And the Red Wings, hockey royalty at one time now. So all they like is a soccer team. So I made one up.
Nice,
And
nice.
yeah, and it's right downtown, and it's everybody lives downtown. It's one of the things that I know about trying to start a team or whatever. You got to buy hearts and minds to convince people that they can spend their money to come see you. So the soccer team is out doing stuff in the community. They're doing
It's a
fundraisers. They're doing fancy fundraisers, but also you know passing out turkeys at Thanksgiving and doing all of those things. So they're in the city doing stuff.
Right. Cool. And the title of this newest one is again A Red Card, am I correct about that?
Yeah, Red Card is the first book.
Red Card.
It's
Okay,
the
Red
Blackjacks. It's called the Blackjacks of Detroit. So the theory is, or the backstory is that the team was supposed to be in Vegas, and a bunch of money men in Michigan, Ann Arbor, and Detroit got together and pooled their money and convinced the league to send them to Detroit, but they couldn't change the name, so
Oh,
it had to be the
wow.
Blackjack. so, but Detroit has casinos. We got plenty of casinos. So one casino bought in on it too. So that's how I set that up. So Red Card's first
Nice.
book, it comes out next Tuesday.
Nice.
And then I've got another book. I've got about 4 books coming out this year in that series. The
Okay,
one
in the series.
standalone book that I wrote, yeah, in the series Blackjack Gentleman, and it's like yeah, I love soccer a lot, and I love Ted Lasso, the show. So
So
I
all
made it.
the whole s Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, the whole series is about the team.
Right. So the whole
Yeah,
series is based in Chicago, and
Detroit,
so I'm sorry,
Detroit.
Detroit. Detroit. I
Yeah,
don't know why I keep saying Chicago. I think it's because we pointed out Chicago in comparison to
because
Detroit.
I keep comparing
Yeah.
it. They compare a lot.
It's alright. It's alright. So, it's obvious that Detroit has become a very influential part of your life. Now tell us where you're based at right now currently?
I am in Greenville, South Carolina.
Greenville, South Carolina. But the
Yeah.
roots are still calling for Detroit.
Yeah, I mean, that's not my home. My home is in Kentucky. I was born in Kentucky, went to school in Louisville. I love Louisville. I've have a
Uh-huh.
couple books set there too. Um, but yeah, my husband and I have already we're at that point where we're like, all right, we got 5 years to figure out what we're going to do with ourselves when we're not working
Mhm.
anymore. And
Right.
so we're probably going because it's beautiful here. It's hard to argue. I mean, I'm standing outside. It's January what 26th. I'm standing
Mhm.
outside, and it's 40 degrees. It's fine.
Oh,
It's no big
well,
deal.
I'm envious.
You know,
It's 29 here.
I know. I did it, girl. I did it. 20 years in Michigan. I know Michigan winters. I do not miss them, but I do miss the Michigan summers. I love the
Right,
summers in Michigan. They're so nice. And we've always said we would have something up there, and we love Detroit. We both love Detroit, so
right.
we'll end up back there in some capacity or another, I
Well,
believe.
even if you get to travel, that's wonderful. Well, thank you
Hmm.
so much
Hmm.
for coming back. It really was a
I'm
delight.
so
You
glad to
always
be
have
back. Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah,
You always
I
have
mean, I came up with Dan Campbell, but don't quote me on if I misquoted some facts. I'm sorry, but I'm
that's
pretty sure that's
alright.
how it goes.
That's alright. We've got you on record that you've already said, "Hey, I don't know everything, but" so we
Yeah,
got
yeah,
you. It's
right.
okay. But thank you so much for coming back on. You always have so much to tell, and you're always a joy to have on the program. Our doors are always
Well,
open to you,
thanks.
Liz, so come back anytime. Thank you again, all our
Thank you,
listeners,
ma'am.
and we'll see you guys next time. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye bye for now.
Bye.